So our moderator this afternoon will be Michelle Atkinson. We're a couple minutes early, Michelle, but I would say let's go ahead and get started.
Hello. So I just want to make a couple of announcements. Number one, those double doors right there, when you go out them, they lock. So don't try to come back in those. The ones down the way will be unlocked and you can come back in those. If you're presenting, you don't have to get on the microphone like this. You can stand back here because it's a presentation microphone, so it picks up all around. Okay. So any questions before we get started? All right. So our first presenter is Dr. Ryan Klein. Okay, here he comes. Great. And his presentation is comparing commonly used tree risk assessment methods. So give it up for Dr. Klein.
Good afternoon, everybody. 1 second. What's that? Yellow is 5, 3. All right. That one not work. All right. So today we're going to be talking about tree risk assessment in general, and then we're going to go through a progression of some different studies that I've been a part of over the years that looked at the different components of tree risk assessment, which kind of led up to the most recent study that we're going to be spending some time with for today. Maybe I'll do that. Anyway, so like I said, we're going to go through these studies. I will warn you that each one of these studies basically had their own presentation associated with them. So it's going to be kind of the down and dirty condensed version of all of them. So if you're interested in anything after this and want to talk about it further, or if you ever line up talks and want to hear something in more detail, just let me know. I'm always happy to speak on the matter. So obviously, everyone in this room is probably pretty familiar with all the benefits that are associated with trees, from aesthetic, environmental, societal factors. But then there's also risks associated with these trees, things like public health and safety. There could be liability related things, disruption of services and activities. But one thing we need to keep in mind is that the risk of a tree failure either injuring or killing somebody is extremely low. In the US, it's about 36 people per year that die of tree-related failures. And in the UK, it's about 6. So it's about the same per capita based off of population size of the countries. So that's where tree risk assessment comes into the equation here. So as far as tree risk assessment goes, there's 3 main components that are looked at throughout the process. And this is pretty common across all the different assessment methods. So you have the likelihood of impact. This is essentially if that tree fails, is it going to hit something? Person, vehicles, damaged property, stuff like that. Likelihood of failure. This has to do with things like extreme weather, defects, likelihood of failing within a set time frame. Typically, we'll look at like 1 to 3 years. And then consequences of failure. If that tree does fail and hits the target, is it going to injure somebody? Is it going to kill them? Is it going to damage that property? And basically, as the assessor or the arborist, you're responsible for letting the client, whether it be a homeowner or a tree manager, know the information that's pertinent to that tree, and then state the different options for mitigating that risk, whether it be removing it or doing some pruning, and then helping them with the decision-making process. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately the tree owner's decision on what happens with that tree. And then there's 3 different levels of assessment that go along with this. So level 1 is commonly what your municipalities are using, where it's either a walk-by or a drive-by. It's kind of that down and dirty, just quick one vantage point. You're going past a tree looking for the worst of the worst. The level 2, which is what we're going to focus on today throughout the different studies. This is a 360-degree inspection of the tree from ground level, and you're going to use basic tools, rubber mallet, D-tape, clinometer, maybe binoculars, stuff like that. And then your level 3 assessment, this is going to be for any additional information you can't get from your level 2. So maybe some sort of sonic tomography or resistograph, trying to detect internal decay. Maybe you're going to use a drone or a static pull test, something like that. And essentially, as the levels of assessment increase, so does the time and the training necessary to complete them. So there's multiple different risk assessment methods that have been used over the years. The more commonly used one in the United States is the track method. And then in the UK is the QTRA method. And we're going to kind of focus on them today. So the other thing you need to keep in mind here when you're talking about risk, whether it be risk of trees or risk of anything, there's this perception of risk as it relates to the actual risk, and they don't always align. So, how I feel about the risk associated with tree might be different than, how anybody else in the room feels about the risk associated with the tree, but ultimately affects the decisions that we make regarding that risk. And it can affect the decision-making process, and then others can affect the decisions that you make based on biasing your perception. So a lot of times you'll see an increased frequency and intensity of disasters related to news stories that are run, where in reality, I said there was only about 36 people a year that die from tree-related injuries in the US, but when you see one on the news, it just seems like they're all falling out of the sky. So it's highly subjective. So this is kind of just a diagram of the different studies we looked at as far as assessing the validity of tree risk assessment. But we looked at those three different components: the likelihood of impact, likelihood of failure, consequences of failure, through 5 different studies. So the first one that we conducted, this was back when I was a master's student. Essentially, we took commercial traffic counters and wanted to see if we could quantify that likelihood of impact component. So basically, how many targets are passing within the fall zone of that tree over the course of about a 2-week period, to where we were able to extrapolate that out to actually get an occupancy within a 24-hour period of time. So we did this on 4 different sites here on campus in relation to some trees that we had identified. And then we took that information to a conference up in Wisconsin and had some arborists use it as part of a video and a photograph survey to see if that additional information of knowing the traffic counts affected their assessment of the likelihood of impact component. So basically, what we found was that the use of traffic counters did decrease the variability. So when they saw that actual number, they were more in line with the actual risk. And the interesting thing here was that the non-certified arborists were slightly more variable. So as you would expect, people with less training, so it kind of just solidified what you would expect. And then we also asked them some survey questions in relation to their assessment of the likelihood of impact based on what they thought of the use of traffic counters. And 64% believed that it actually changed their perception of the occupancy at the site. And then 70% believe that these would be worthwhile investments to have these if you're an arborist regularly practicing risk assessments. So some conclusions here. We were able to quantify the occupancy. Obviously, there's still that subjective assessment of what that number means in relation to you trying to use it within the assessment method. But it can be a useful tool for people that are doing risk assessments. But we don't really do that much here in the US. This is something that's more done in the UK and Australia with some of their methods. Here, it's all based off of qualitative terms, and we just put them in a matrix. And then target occupancy was found to be highly variable. So if you went during rush hour, 7, 8 in the morning versus if you went like 2 in the afternoon, you would see considerably different occupancy levels. Same with weekends versus weekdays, holidays, stuff like that. So there's different variation there. But ultimately, the assessment method that we were looking at, track method, based off of the ISA BMPs, it doesn't give you any guidelines on how to interpret this data. So we did a follow-up to that study where we made homemade traffic counters because the commercial systems were about $2,000 for one set. So we were able to build homemade traffic counters based off of buying stuff on Amazon. It was about $160 to construct one of these things. And basically what we found was that there was a high degree of variability across the systems we tested. So not only the homemade system, but the commercial system, the counts didn't always match up with what was happening in reality. We stood out there with a hand clicker We found that they were affected by different things like sunlight and heat. You had all these different settings that you could kind of adjust, but at the end of the day, there was still a lot of variability with the systems. So as far as the homemade systems, we'd like to repeat this study at some point by modifying the code, maybe use different sensor types. There's probably a dozen or so you can buy on Amazon. We only tested out 2 different ones, and then alter the design. Original design was just one of these Pelican boxes. And then once I realized that the glare of the light was throwing the counts off, I went inside and grabbed a toilet paper tube and put it on the end of the sensor, and it took care of the problem. So there's different things we might be able to do that would be cheap solutions. So we really don't know how precise these systems need to be in order to, affect the occupancy in relation to the assessment methods. But ultimately, even if we have a number here, it's left to the assessor to determine, what that number means and how to apply it to the system. So there's still a high level of subjectivity. As far as that goes, we still don't have the guidelines after the second study concluded. But if, you have a tree, basically the whole assessment method hinges on this occupancy component. If there is no occupancy, there is no risk. Think of a tree out in that open field. It could, blow over at any second because it's got every defect in the world. Maybe there's a bomb strapped to it too, just something crazy. But if you put that same tree downtown in, a metropolitan area, something like that, then there's a high level of risk associated with that tree if it's got all those defects and that bomb strapped to it. So that's one of the things you need to realize. We don't understand what, this number could potentially affect and how much wiggle room you have there. But it could lead to, unwarranted removals or the retention of unsafe trees. So basically, we kind of concluded here is that being able to quantify this number could potentially lead to more accurate and consistent assessments. So the next study we took part in had to do with the likelihood of failure component of tree risk assessment. And this is kind of a difficult one to assess. You basically need to know what trees you have prior to those trees failing and then be able to go in and follow up that assessment. So we were fortunate enough to where there was an inventory of about 20,000 trees. We ended up looking at about 4,000 of those 20,000. 15 different species were included in that, but they had just been assessed in Naples, Florida prior to Hurricane Irma. So we're fortunate enough to get the data on the back end of that, where some Forest Service group went in and reassessed those trees. So we were able to match up some of the different failure types in relation to going through this storm. The storm was a category 1 once it hit the study site. So it was about 76 mile an hour sustained wind speeds. And we looked at, like I said, the different failure types, but then also the recommended mitigation from the assessment team that followed up. So what we found was that over 80% of all the trees survived. So obviously it's kind of in that sweet spot to where, 76 mile an hour is not a category 5, but it's, more than those normal 40 to 50 mile an hour winds that we're used to. And then 70% or 74% had no damage whatsoever. So, 3/4 of them did really, really well. 15% were whole tree failures. So the whole tree was either knocked over or it had so much damage that it had to be removed. And then the tree that survived the least, so had the highest failure rate, was Bolnesia arborea. And then over half the species we assessed had survival rates of greater than 90%. So again, most of these trees did very, very well. And what we found was that as far as the factors that influence tree damage, as DBH increased, so the diameter of the trees moved to a lesser damage category. And then individuals near utility lines were 9 times more likely to be in a lower damage category. And we kind of related this back to, if you think of the utility sector, they're usually on a 3 to 4 year time cycle of when they're pruning their trees. So most major defects associated with the trees that were near utility lines would have been pruned out. So the trees that were failing were the ones that had, the severe defects, and those next to the utility lines wouldn't have had those. So some of the conclusions we had, more research, like always, is going to be needed to help develop these species failure profiles. In the state of Florida, we don't have many. There was a study back from 2004 that puts them together, but there's still a lot of information we're lacking there, especially related to these subtropical, tropical species. We need more examples of species. So we know very little about a handful of species. We need more repetition of the species we know about, and then expand on that species list. And then some of the factors that are inducing the failure. There's these intrinsic and extrinsic factors, which I didn't really get to touch on, but essentially it's the things, within the tree, those defects maybe, and then those things with outside of the trees. Could be site conditions, it could be your weather, stuff like that. We need to have a better understanding of that. And then basically these profiles that we could develop can help with the management of our trees moving forward, specifically in urban areas. So the next two studies we're going to go through here deal with the consequences of failure component. And this is, if it hits that target, what's going to happen, death, injury, damage. So we had 106 participants up in Wisconsin, assessed 3 trees using ISA BMP method, which is essentially this track method we're going to talk about here later. And basically, they went through, they did their assessment, and then they also tried to gauge the size of the part and the fall distance. So that plays into consequences of failure. Depending how big a part is and how high up it is going to tell you how much damage is going to occur. And then there's also protection factors. Maybe it'll hit another tree that's nearby before it hits the person. So then instead of killing them, maybe it breaks their arm. So what we found was that the previous training experience positively influenced the variability of the ratings. And then we also did some survey questions along with it, to where 70% believe that the current definitions of how we look at consequences of failure are clear and easy to follow. And again, keep in mind, those are those qualitative terms, and the way you're assessing them are also qualitative terms, so there's no quantification associated with it. And then 67% felt confident in their ability to predict the injury, the damage, disruption, stuff like that, based off of our current use of consequences of failure. So there was some statistically significant differences for diameter and fall distance estimation between the groups we assessed. And the variations were generally small. So even the groups with the least experience and training, it wouldn't really affect the outcome of the assessment, which was good to hear. And most of these assessment methods have, enough wiggle room built in to where, unless you're at one extreme and, in reality, it's closer to the other extreme, it won't affect the outcome of the assessment. But if you're kind of right next to each other, on these 4-point rating systems, you're probably going to be pretty close with the ultimate risk rating. And then we also need more research on this to kind of help produce these guidelines, but based off of, the size and the target combination. So how big of a, tree part can you have, and what's the outcome as far as the damage or the death, injury, all that associated with it. It's very gloomy up here, isn't it? Lots of death and damage. I can see the faces. So this was kind of like our follow-up to that. Instead of actually having people out there assessing the trees, this time we went to a conference with 20 cross-section, images that were posted to a wall ranging from 4 inches up to 39 inches. And then we also included aerial shots of an actual tree in the urban landscape plus a street view, so they could visualize, okay, here's the size of the part. Can you just look at this image on the wall and judge how big it is? So we looked at, can you gauge how big that part is, 20 foot up in the tree, 10 foot up in the tree, but can you just, even at its simplest form, gauge how big that part is to where it's at on a wall right in front of you? Hey, Melissa, how long has that been on?
For about 40 seconds.
Okay, great. So basically, we had some similar results to the previous study, because I have blown this time thing. So the study that we
you have 5 additional minutes for questions. You can go into that.
all right, perfect. I'm long-winded, folks, sorry. So the study that this all kind of pushed us towards was comparing methods. So it's that track method and QTRA method, US, UK, some differences, a lot of similarities. The previous research that had been done just in general on tree risk assessment basically pointed to the fact that The assessor has, just as much influence as the method being used. And then the assessor also is a big cause of the variability. And we have this preconceived notion that just because you have expert or training and experience means you're an expert, which is not always the case. And so here's what the track form looks like. It's a big fancy paper just to get you up to the matrix. You're using qualitative terms throughout the process. So you're making these subjective assessments based off of some training that you've had, but at the end of the day, it's still the individual assessing the tree, making the determination of what the risk associated with it is. It's based off those three components. This is the QTRA system, also based off the three components. The difference is the likelihood of impact for this actually has, so if you look at the left there, table 2 targets, it has different ranges. So you can kind of stand out there maybe with a stopwatch or count, during the 20 minutes you're on site to kind of visualize the occupancy. And then you can put it into this table and it'll tell you what the target range will be associated with it. So it's a little bit more quantifiable, but it assumes you can count and assumes you're paying attention. And it assumes, there's not some other subjective deterrent from that. And then also the probability of failure is, the size, top left. That's based off of the diameter of the tree part. So you are actually taking that information and putting into the system. So what we did is we used a video survey of 3 trees. Okay, video survey of 3 trees, sent it out to 150 people in the track group, 150 in the QTRA group, and then 150 that didn't have either assessment method, but they were certified arborists. So we sent them the track method because they were also from the US. And we provided them, these videos, a cheat sheet, a risk calculator, and then we also had some surveys associated. We wanted to gauge their tolerance for financial risks, health risks, stuff like that, to see maybe if, their perception of risk altered how they assess the trees. So I'm going to skip over this. It's essentially a video of what they saw because I'm really short on time, but they got 3 to 5 minute videos of all the different tree parts, site conditions, species of the tree, location, stuff like this. It was primarily all men that ended up responding to the survey. The interesting thing on this, that if you point your eyes down to the certified arborist portion, there's 0 certified arborists in the quantified tree risk assessment or QTRA group, where most of the track qualified, 82% were certified arborists. The other interesting thing is the medium number of annual risk assessments for the QTRA group was 500 in comparison to 25 for the track. So essentially, if you look at these, they had pretty similar ratings across the board. The QTRA, it's on a 3-point rating system where the others are 4 points. But if you look at it, based off of how these are weighted, they're pretty similar across the groups, with the lower risk end and the higher risk end. And then when you look at this here, basically it looks at, okay, did they recommend removal, monitoring, some sort of mitigation in between, like pruning, cabling. Essentially, the QTRA group recommended removal less, monitoring more, and the track groups, both of them, recommended removal more. So here in the US, we are recommending removals a lot more than over in the UK and Australia. This here basically only applies to the track group, where if you took the time frame for that likelihood of failure component and went from 1 year and extended it out to 3 years, you basically, there was no variability. It stayed consistent. It just increased over that time. So like you would expect, if you have a tree that has some sort of major defect, you'd expect the longer you go, more likely that tree is going to fail. So might not fail in 1 year, but it's probably going to fail in 5 years or 20. But on a 3 year, it just increased like you would expect. And then there were no differences when we looked at the financial and the health risk questions. Reproducibility was similar across the board. And there was no variability found in the track inputs, unlike previous studies from Kozer et al. And then some of the conclusions here is that the track assessment was no more variable over time. So that was a big one, because they've talked about modifying the assessment method based off of a longer timeline. The arborists in the US might be more concerned about liability based off of them wanting to remove trees more often than people in the UK. So obviously, you know, we're a little bit maybe more sue happy culture here in the US. The UK might be more concerned with preservation. You go over there, you see some really nasty looking trees that they're preserving, where here we would cut them down just based off of the aesthetics. And then let's see, basically the main takeaways, we found some ways to quantify tree risk assessment. And, you know, this could lead to more accurate and consistent methods in the future. But we still don't exactly know how the psychology of trees and risk play out with the individuals doing the assessments. All right, I assume I have no time for questions, and I apologize. All right, give me your best 52-second question. Yes.
Okay, so when you talk about financial considerations, what are you looking at? Or like a head hitting a house, hitting an individual, or what we deal with a lot of proximity to homes and sidewalks for damage?
Yeah, so specifically, when we're talking about, so the question was, when we're talking about financial situations related to risk, and so basically we had this 10-point Likert scale system, and we had all these questions specifically to the financial side of it. It's like, would you gamble your paycheck away? Would you go out and buy a sports car? So it was basically gauging, you know, how much they valued money in relation to the potential risk associated with the ramifications if it went bad. And then the same for the health side, it was, you know, related to health concerns similarly. Okay, sorry.